does all of the procedural things, and so we will transition now to our first speaker of the afternoon, who is Michael Zimmerman. And so Michael will be presenting his thesis work entitled Overcoming Barriers to Wind Energy Development, a case study analysis of Native American projects. And so his thesis advisor is Tony Reams in School for Environment and Sustainability, and his reader was Pam Jagger, also from SEAS. And so Michael, I will turn it over to you so you can share your screen and share your work with us. Thanks.
Thank you, I appreciate it. Can everyone hear me okay? Cool, so I'm going to share my screen here. All right, can everyone see okay? It's all loaded up? Sounds good, awesome. So before I begin, I just wanted to thank everybody for coming today. I'm gonna start my little timer here. Thank you all so much for coming online. It's great to see everyone who I've been working with for the past year or so. I do want to specifically thank my advisor, Dr. Tony Reams. He's been an amazing support, and his contributions and encouragement have been wonderful throughout the past year or so. I also want to thank my reader, of course, Dr. Pamela Yeager, as well as Jason and Jamie for their help and encouragement as well throughout this process. So thank you everyone who's been involved along the way. So as Dr. Miller mentioned, my project is called Overcoming Barriers to Wind Energy Development, a case study analysis of Native American projects. And so before I begin, I do think it's important just to kind of share my interest in this area. So my interest stems from my past research with Dr. Reams into energy efficiency and energy equity across the United States. And so through that research, I have been looking at various maps of energy resources and energy efficiency across the United States. And during that research, I came across a map called the Tribal Energy Atlas, which illustrates the renewable energy potential on Native American lands. And so I was exploring that map and I realized that there's a ton of renewable energy potential on Native American lands that hasn't been developed. And so this led me to ask the question, why isn't this amazing resource being developed on tribal lands? And so I'll return to that question a little bit, but I just thought it was important to express my interest in this area before I begin. So diving in, oh, how do I change this? There we go. So diving in, I did frame my project through the lens of energy justice. And so I relied on an article from Dan Hernandez from 2015, who illustrates 4 key pillars to energy justice. So she describes energy justice as entailing the right to healthy, sustainable energy production, the right to the best available energy infrastructure, the right to affordable energy, and the right to uninterrupted energy service. So with regards to this last pillar here, the United States claims to provide accessible electricity to 100% of its citizens. However, 40% of the Pine Ridge Reservation population and 37.5% of the Navajo Nation households live without access to electricity. So clearly this statistic that the US is claiming to have is not equitable across all of its citizens in the country. So diving back into that question that I posed earlier, why isn't this resource being developed? So tribal lands hold almost 8% of the national generation potential for wind energy. So as you can see on the map on the right hand here, a lot of tribal lands do lie in the Midwest there in the Great Plains. And so the darker colors obviously present as more higher class wind resource. And so there's a ton of resource potential there. Yet only one utility scale project exists on tribal lands. And this is it's called the Kumeyaay Wind Farm outside of San Diego in California. Despite this, though, numerous projects have been unsuccessful. They have been proposed, including a 700 megawatt project proposed by the Navajo Nation, as well as 220 megawatts proposed by the Rosebud Sioux, which I'll come back to in a little bit. So again, why are wind projects not being developed on tribal lands? Previous research does a pretty good job of answering this, and a lot of it comes down to the federal government's relationship to tribes. And this relationship is called the Federal Trust Responsibility, and it was determined over a series of Supreme Court decisions in the 1820s called the Marshall Trilogy, which determined that Indian tribes are sovereign entities, but under the authority of the federal government. This is a very confusing and complicated relationship, but I felt that this quote below does a great job of summarizing it. So I'll just read that for you here. So with a status of domestic dependent nations within the United States, the court decreed that Indian lands could not be legally encumbered or conveyed without the approval of the United States government acting as trustee for Indian lands and obligated to manage those lands for the welfare of tribes and their citizens. So in 1824, the United States government created an agency called the Bureau of Indian Affairs, or the BIA, which its purpose is to oversee any transaction between a tribe and a non-tribal entity in terms of mineral resources, in terms of land management. And so the BIA is obligated to act in the best interest for their tribes. It's meant to prove that these contracts between tribes and non-tribal entities are in good faith, essentially. But a congressional hearing of tribal leaders in 2011 revealed that challenges to tribal wind energy development include significant BIA inefficiencies. And so there are many examples of BIA inefficiencies, but at a basic level, they include tribes noting that the BIA has taken up to 8 years to review necessary documents, necessary contracts, necessary permitting requests. And as a result of these significant delays, tribes have cited losses of up to $100 million in lost revenues. They've lost connection requests to local utilities, and they've found that data that they've collected has actually been determined invalid as a result of the BIA taking so long to look over their documents. So that is a major impediment to tribal energy development for wind energy. Additionally, though, it is very difficult for tribes to secure financial backing for their wind projects. So one single wind turbine costs about $2 million, and so projects in the hundreds of megawatt range, those are very expensive. It costs hundreds of millions of dollars. And so in order to secure financing for these projects, tribes have to look to non-tribal investors, which exposes them to a lot of risk and liability that they're often not willing to take on. Additionally, as sovereign entities, tribes are not eligible for the production tax credit, which is something that makes wind projects largely competitive with fossil fuel projects. And so as a result of being ineligible, a lot of times tribes are not able to, again, finance these projects. Additionally, it is important to mention that internal conflict within tribes also plays a significant role. A tribal council is its governing body, and it operates a lot like the United States Congress, with a lot of turnover, a lot of different interests. And so as a result of this, it causes farther delays in fractionating within the tribe itself. So we know what the barriers to wind energy development are on tribal lands and why they exist. What we don't know is how these barriers to tribal wind energy development influence each step of the development process, and we also don't know how different strategies to overcome these barriers impact the project's eventual outcome. And so my project is going to be focusing on these two key questions here. And so I evaluated these questions through a comparative framework. So I have two different case studies. The first is the Rosebud Sioux project. It's a project that was conducted during the early 2000s, and it was unsuccessful. And then I'm also evaluating the Ocheti-Sakowin Power Authority project, which is an ongoing project. And so we don't know the result yet. But I'm evaluating both these projects through a 5-step framework. So I determined 5 important steps to the development processes. The first is understanding the wind resource, so wind resource assessment, then project permitting, the proximity to transmission infrastructure, the power purchaser or market, so who's buying the power, as well as, of course, securing financing for the project. And I conducted this analysis by analyzing project reports, scholarly articles, news articles, as well as previously conducted and published interviews with tribal officials involved in the project. So diving into my results for the first project. So the Rosebud Sioux, as I mentioned, this was a previously unsuccessful project. It was called the North Antelope Highlands Wind Project, and it was expected to develop 190 megawatts across the Rosebud Reservation in South Dakota. So in terms of its project permitting, the Rosebud Sioux did secure all necessary permits. In terms of its transmission, I have a little map in the right hand there. So there's a black line running across it. They're expecting to use that transmission line for their infrastructure. In terms of its power purchase agreement, so its power buyer, this is where the Rosebud Sioux encountered the majority of its problems. So they tried to sell their energy to 3 main groups. The first was Basin Electric, which is a utility in North Dakota, but Basin Electric cited that the Rosebud Sioux project was not at a large enough scale to offer competitive rates, so this did not work. The Rosebud Sioux also sought to transfer their power east over the Midwestern system operator, so essentially the Midwest grid, but this would have added too many costs to the project to be competitive on the East Coast. Additionally, the Rosebud Sioux sought to sell their energy to the Western Area Power Administration, or WAPA, but this was also unsuccessful because WAPA has a clause that they cannot enter into agreements beyond 5 years, but in order to secure financing, the Rosebud Sioux would have needed an agreement of about 20 to 25 years, so this also was unsuccessful. In terms of project financing, had they been able to find a buyer, the Rosebud Sioux were going to act as a passive landowner and simply lease their land to the project owner, and they would have received $33,000 per developed megawatt in exchange, as well as a portion of the gross revenue stream. Okay, so on to case two, the Oceti-Sakowin Power Authority, or the OSPA. It's a little bit more complicated, so I'm going to give you some background here. So the OSPA is actually a coalition of 6 different tribes, as you can see in the map. One of those tribes is indeed the Rosebud Sioux. And so the OSPA is actually a nonprofit corporation chartered under Section 17 of the 1934 Indian Reorganization Act. And as a nonprofit, as a Section 17 corporation, this entitles the the OSPA to a couple key elements. First is they do not rely on the BIA for oversight in terms of any agreement for up to 25 years. So they can operate independent of that government oversight. Additionally, as a corporation, the OSPA can actually take on liability without transferring that back to its member tribes. The OSPA is also the owner of a joint venture with the Apex Clean Energy, which is a non-tribal entity. And as a result of that joint venture, the project is actually tax credit eligible, which is a significant boon. So they are eligible for the PTC. And then finally, the OSPA has already been authorized by its member tribes to enter into contracts. So the OSPA does not need to go back to its member tribes to secure approval for any agreement. So there should be no delays there. With regards to its results in terms of its wind resource, the OSPA expects to develop over 1,000 megawatts across its tribal lands. There are currently 570 megawatts planned. It is in progress securing all necessary permits. It too is expecting to use that same transmission line across South Dakota, as well as a hydroelectric dam in northern South Dakota. In terms of its power purchase agreement, the OSPA expects to sell into the Southwest Power Pool, or the SPP, but they still need to find a buyer to actually offload that power, which they have not yet accomplished. In terms of financing, the OSPA, again, is the majority owner, so they own a 51% ownership stake in its joint venture. And so they will be actually financing and developing their own project as opposed to being a passive owner. In terms of financing the project, the OSPA is expecting to monetize the production tax credit, which it qualifies for, at an 80% value for tax equity investors, as well as issue tax-exempt bonds. So I phrased my discussion section through the lens of those 4 initial challenges that I talked about previously and how each of those challenges intersects with both projects' processes. And so in terms of BIA inefficiencies, the Rosebud Sioux luckily actually did not encounter any BIA inefficiencies, but this was largely due to the part that they unfortunately did not get to a point where the BIA needed to actually approve any contracts. Meanwhile, the OSPA does not rely on the BIA for leases up to 25 years, so they're operating very independently there. In terms of securing financing, the Rosebud Sioux, again, they were expecting to act as a passive landowner and simply let the project owner finance the project, whereas the OSPA is actually taking an active ownership role and monetizing the PTC at its 80% value, as well as issuing tax-exempt bonds. In terms of tax credit eligibility, the Rosebud Sioux, operating as a tribe, was ineligible for the PTC, which is why they had to outsource the project to a third party, a non-tribal owner, whereas the OSPA project is actually eligible for the PTC as a Section 17 chartered corporation in a joint venture partnership with a non-tribal entity. And then finally, in terms of internal delays, the Rosebud Sioux encountered a few delays collecting permitting reports, nothing that actually led to the collapse of the project at all. But the OSPA has received pre-authorization from member tribes to act on their behalf. So they have not yet encountered any delays there. So my overall conclusions, I've just kind of discussed the advantages and disadvantages of both strategies. So real quickly here, the Rosebud Sioux, their strategy did guarantee significant financial royalties and a percentage of the project's revenue stream to the tribe had it been successful. So that's a guaranteed profit for the tribe. However, the tribe was left vulnerable to the project owner's eventual plans. So the project owner could sell or change the project plans as they saw fit. And the Rosebud Sioux also did not have a plan in place for when its contract with the project owner had expired. So 25 years down the line, they were not going to have any plan in place to maintain or operate the wind farm. Meanwhile, for the OSPA's strategies protected it from BIA inefficiencies as well as internal tribal disagreements. The OSPA strategy qualified for the PTC, and it also maintained a controlling interest in the project, and so that it ensured tribal control throughout the whole process. However, the OSPA project was reliant on tax equity financing via the PTC, which does expose them to certain risks, given that we actually don't know what the future of the production tax credit holds. So overall, a key limitation that both projects are encountered and the OSPA is still working on is finding a buyer for its energy. And so a major reason that this is a problem is that they are unable to find affordable transmission infrastructure. And so the Rosebud Sioux were unable to ship their power east. And the OSPA, similarly, they have to find a buyer in a major urban center or a major utility, but there is no affordable infrastructure to do this. And so while they are expecting to have to develop their own infrastructure, they shouldn't have to. It's the responsibility of the BIA as the trustee for Indian lands to develop this infrastructure and ensure the welfare of tribes. And so my overall takeaways here is that while this issue of the government not actually maintaining its obligation to tribal welfare still must be addressed, the OSPA has indeed constructed a strategy that likely will succeed and that tribes can develop wind energy despite these pre-existing barriers. So my message is one of hope for the OSP strategy, that I'm hoping other tribal projects seeking to develop wind energy can capitalize upon this study and see that they actually can succeed despite these pre-existing challenges. So thank you all so much for listening, and let me know if you have any questions. Oh, how do I cancel this? There we go.
Good. Yeah, you found it. All right, well, thank you so much, Michael, for that great presentation. So if anyone wishes, they can unmute their microphone at this point and ask a question, or we'll also give a few minutes for folks to put anything in the comment box you would like to ask.
So I had a question for you, Michael. I was wondering why you selected these two specific cases, right? So earlier in your presentation, you mentioned that there was a Navajo project outside of San Diego, and I'm just kind of wondering why these two specific cases, how generalizable are some of the findings from these cases to other cases, and I wonder if you could just speak a little bit about that.
Yeah, definitely. That's a great question. So I selected these two projects for two specific reasons. The first one is that the Rosebud Sioux, they had tried to do this project independently in the early 2000s before joining the OSPA as a coalition. And so I felt that kind of examining this through the lens of the Rosebud Sioux, from again operating independently to joining this coalition, provided a really wonderful lens to see essentially why they felt that their strategy needed to change, right? So we can kind of see how they were unsuccessful in part one, and then they're expecting to be successful through the OSPA. And so that provides a really clear lens of change between the strategies. And then part two is both the Rosebud Sioux projects and the OSPA projects are operating in South Dakota, and thus both have to adhere to the same state policies. So as opposed to discussing the Rosebud Sioux versus the Navajo Nation, which would be different in external state policies, I would really want to focus my project on the actual internal strategies as opposed to kind of the external factors of state policies. With regards to how applicable these strategies are to outside, or I guess other tribes, I'm not sure. I think that's a great question, and it's definitely a really cool area for future study. I mean, so the Rosebud Sioux really did focus on a pretty traditional strategy in terms of the passive land ownership and land lease strategy, and that was unsuccessful. But the OSPA as a coalition, that's a very unique geographic situation that they're in, of having such so many tribal lands in the same state with such great wind resources. And so it definitely is a question that I'm asking moving forward, is this strategy replicable in other areas of the nation if it is successful? So I don't have an answer for that one yet, but no, it's definitely a great question. Yeah, thank you for asking.
Additional questions? So I actually have one, which actually goes to the policy aspects that you pointed to. And I mean, you were definitely looking at more internal strategies, but obviously tribal policy and US policy is conflicted and difficult and very complicated. If there were policy levers or things that you could change, what might those be, or what might be sort of the biggest hurdle, I think, from what you could or would change?
I think the largest factor is making tribes eligible for the production tax credit. So that is going to be, from my research across various different projects as well, that's the largest challenge that tribes face, is the production tax credit can make up to 17% of those projects' baselines, and so that's a major economic incentive to develop these projects. And so the OSPA was extremely creative in finding this, I would say, loophole by creating this chartered corporation and then creating a non-tribal entity joint venture with a utility to qualify for that production tax credit. But this is something that tribes are advocating for, that energy justice advocates are fighting for, is just make tribes eligible for the PTC. It's a simple thing, and it would just spur so much development and be really positive for everyone involved. So I think that would be the key policy I would point to.
Great. And then Stacy Coyle had submitted a question through the chat box, which had to do with those tribes who have historically been able to provide coal-fired power plants like the Navajo, whether or not they'd have leg up on this kind of opportunity. And so her question is, BIA doesn't even provide adequate water infrastructure for many of these reservations. Their tendency would be to find private companies to lease and develop. So how do you see sort of the historical coal-fired power infrastructure in those tribal nations that have actually been able to have things like coal-fired power? Are they advantaged or disadvantaged in a specific way for these other opportunities?
That's a great question. I haven't actually thought about it through this lens before. I would expect that the advantages are in having the previous experience of developing energy infrastructure in general, right? So the tribes that have successfully developed fossil fuel resources, they understand the transmission infrastructure needed to outsource this energy to, whether it's tribal residents, whether it's to external sources, whatever it is. And so that is a major thing. Of course, fossil fuels and coal are extremely different than renewable energy, than wind energy specifically. So I'm not too sure. I just don't know the processes well enough to give you a full answer there, to if those are going to be replicable for wind energy, for a sustainable technology. But I would expect just kind of understanding the working with the local utility, whether it's working with state policymakers, whatever it is. I think that those definitely are skills that would completely come in handy. That's a really good question, though, and I'd love to look more into that kind of as the study progresses. Yeah, thank you for asking.
Great, thank you so much. And so I think we'll move on to our next speaker, but thank you,
Good.
Michael. And so
Yeah,
we
thank
will
you, everyone.
virtually applaud your presentation, but thank you for all of the work that you've done, and it's obviously showcased here. So thank you.
I appreciate
Well
it. Thank you.
So our next speaker is Ashley Mark. And so for those of you who watch the